Welcome to Getting Under the Surface, episode 6. I'm Joey Donovan Guido, and in this episode, we'll be talking with Janine Kwoh, who is the author of the book Welcome to the Grief Club, which she created after experiencing how hard and complicated grief can be when she lost her partner, Nap. Both Janine and Nap were in their late 20s when he passed away. Janine is also the owner and designer of Kwohtations, which is a really cool name, by the way. It's a Brooklyn-based stationery company and letterpress print and design studio. Kwohtations is an ever-evolving collection of greeting cards and gifts that reflect and celebrate a diversity of identities and life experiences, always with humor and empathy. And what's interesting is, even though Janine's book is about grief, she brings that humor and empathy into the book. It makes it, I think, a really good read, and really kind of like personalizes it as well. And today's topics are going to include: there is no right or wrong way to grieve, acceptable places to cry, being on fire without anyone noticing, how to be supportive to a grieving person, and the role humor can play when we are grieving. Janine, welcome.
Hi, Joy. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk with you as well, and thank you so much for being here today.
Of course.
And let's dive into the first question. In the book, you write, you may feel like you should be grieving less, or at least more privately, and moving through your grief more quickly than you are. This ties into the fact that there is no right or wrong way to grieve. Can you tell us more about that and how to deal with these expectations we put on ourselves while we're grieving?
Mhm. Sure. So, this theme throughout the book really came from my own experience of grief and a lot of the questions and struggles I had about, am I grieving correctly? Is my grief valid? Am I grieving too much or grieving incorrectly? And, a lot of that came from I think the fact that I experienced grief at such a young age. As you mentioned, my partner Nap died when we were both 28, and he was the first person I loved who died. And I just had no idea what to expect. And, at the time in my peer group, not a lot of people had experienced a significant loss. So I felt like my friends wanted to be there for me, but none of us really had experienced grief. And so I look to sort of like external cues for how, I don't know, how my grief should go. And I and and I think as a society, we're not good at talking about grief or making space for grief. And in turn, it made me feel like, again, like I was taking it too hard. I think that because we don't talk about grief, it can feel like you should be moving on, right?
Mm.
Even though people don't necessarily talk to you about your grief because they don't want to make you feel bad, or they don't know what to say. But I think the impact of that can make it feel like, oh, maybe it's time for me to stop talking about it, and maybe it's time for me to move on from it. And that can be really hard. Um, I think structurally also, um, for those of us who work in an office, like there's no federally mandated bereavement leave. Our
Mm.
bereavement leave is, 3 to 5 days, which can be another signal that, maybe the worst of your grief should be over in less than a week, which is, which like for anyone who's gone through it, it's just like, that's nothing, right? But I think, I look to sort of these societal cues for how much I should be grieving, and everything sort of pointed me in the direction of, I should be getting over it. And, all of that sort of made me feel like I wasn't grieving correctly because I was still struggling with it for so long. In terms of what to do about that, I think it's so hard, and like I have probably still more questions than answers about grief. But I think realizing that grief takes a long time. In some ways, like you never get over it. You just learn to carry it and it does change over time. But I think giving yourself the time and space as much as possible and the permission to grieve is helpful because losing someone you love is so hard. Like grieving is so, so hard. And on top of that, if you put judgment or um if you feel like you shouldn't be grieving, it's too much for one person.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that's that judgment part. Okay, I think can be so hard, and that was kind of already touched on my second question, which was how to accept and not judge this grieving process. You know, we all experience grief differently, right? So essentially, there's no right or wrong way to experience it or to grieve. But I can see where like these outside forces like make you feel like, oh, I must be doing it wrong because they only gave me 3 to 5 days, which really is like that. I mean, that's enough time to like plan a funeral
Right.
or, and get people to gather somewhere to honor somebody. That there's no time baked into that to cope or deal with it in your own way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's part of the reason why I wrote the book because I felt really alone in my grief. And also I think a lot of grieving happens in private and I remember thinking like I don't see anyone else grieving, right? Like I don't see anyone else like crying in the bathroom at work or like crying on the subway, so I must be the only one. And so, I wanted the book to be a counter voice to all those other sort of societal cues and to say, you know, of course this is hard. Of course you're grieving. Take all the time you need. And also like you are not alone, even if it feels that way, because that's definitely how I felt.
Mm. Yeah, I have for many years I had a dad blog called Daddy Brain, and that was always my last sentence for every single blog post. You are not alone.
Hmm.
And yeah, that's one. You reminded me of one of the pieces of art in your book where everybody's at the train station and everybody's standing there and in their grief or sitting there in their grief. And externally, nobody can see it. And everybody's like, oh, look, that person, they look fine. Why do they look fine? And I've got this grief. And the other person's kind of saying the same thing about the other people. And I see that too. I see as a society, at least here in America, it is almost like taboo to talk about grief or even how you're feeling, especially if you're a guy.
Right.
And that feeling of being alone can be very oppressive. So I think, with the book and the way you've created the book, I think that kind of debunks that myth that we're alone in this. There's so many of us experiencing different kinds of grief and coping in our own ways. And I feel like not really getting the support that's necessary, which leads me to my third question. What if someone wants to be present and supportive to someone who's grieving? What's the best way to approach being supportive so it's actually helpful and doesn't come off as condescending, insensitive, or sounding like you think the grieving person should suck it up, so to
Hmm.
speak?
Yeah, this is a question that I get a lot, and I think the first thing I say is I think the most important thing is to just say something. It doesn't have to be the most comforting or like the perfect thing to say, right? In some ways, there is no perfect thing to say. There's nothing we can say or do that will really make that person not be grieving. um, But I think there's something really important in just acknowledging what it is that they're going through. I think that goes a really long way in helping them just feel seen and feel like we were talking about less alone. Um, so I think even, something simple like, I'm really sorry. Like, I'm really sorry for your loss. And this is so hard. I'm sorry you're going through this. Or even just, I don't know what to say. You can you can also say that. Um, But again, I think it's just the act of saying something that is the most important. Um, that said, I do think that there are some things that you shouldn't say, which which I touch upon in the book. Um, like, in general, I would say, like, things like, any sentence that starts with, like, "at least," um, is is good kind of good to stay away from, like, "At least
Mm,
you got to say goodbye," or "At least they were old," and I understand where those statements are coming from, like, we want the person to feel better, we want them to, like, look on the bright side, but I think a lot of times, inadvertently, it can minimize that person's loss. Like, it can sound like, "Oh, like, maybe I shouldn't feel that badly because, at least XYZ." Um, I think comparisons, like, any comparisons of grief or loss are hard,
mm,
um, and again, like, could inadvertently make someone feel like their loss is minimized, and it's hard because we just can't really compare losses. Each one is unique. Even if you lost the same person, your loss is different and your grief is different. Um, and kind of like the last one is just like everything happens for a reason is I think like universally everyone's least favorite statement. But I feel like as long as you stay away from those, like there's there's not really anything you can say that is wrong.
mm,
Um, I
yeah.
don't know. What do you think about that?
I agree with you, and you made me think of a couple of things actually. One was just like just acknowledging that, hey, I understand, I see you. That's kind of an overused phrase in our society right now, but it's an important one. I see you, I understand, or I see that you have a loss. I'm not saying this the best way, but really just acknowledging the person and that they're going through something. And I think you're right. I think sometimes we try to fix things for other people, and this is not something that's fixable. This is not like putting a new band-aid on a cut that'll eventually heal. This is acknowledging the person. And I think that, like, in my case, I've got a sick wife. Thank goodness she's still alive, but she's been sick for years. And when people just acknowledge, hey man, that must be hard.
Yeah.
Like, I feel seen, I feel heard, and I don't feel as lame because I feel lame. Like, well, why can't I deal with this better? And it's like, well, I'm dealing with it in the best way I can. And then I come to work, and I go through my meetings and I go through my day, and it's on my mind the whole day what my wife is experiencing, but nobody knows.
Yeah.
And so it can be really difficult. And there was something else you made me think of. Yeah, like saying, at least you had 5 years, or everything happens for a reason. It's I could see how that could easily, even though someone means well and they're probably uncomfortable and don't know what to say, that almost like delegitimizes your experience,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. But and then again, like I don't want to. I there are those things that I think can be tricky,
Hmm.
but I don't want to scare people off from saying something because they're afraid that they're going to say the wrong thing. It's
Yeah.
hard to show up for people who are going through something tough. Like I have been on both sides of it now. And so I'm much more likely to say something because I
Mhm.
know how valuable that is. And at the same time, like I know that I've said stuff that's like unhelpful or not comforting, but
Me
but I
too.
yeah. So it's okay if we don't get it right every time.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think engaging is better than not. And the other thing you made me think of is one of my buddies. He runs a men's group that I was part of for many years, and this helped me deal with my emotions that I was experiencing from my wife's illness. And he read this thing once to me, and I thought it was so powerful. He said, you can't fix it. You can't fix somebody's hurt or pain or suffering, but you can say to them, hey, I'm sorry that you're suffering. I'm sorry that you're experiencing this.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that could be taken the wrong way. And it might open up a discussion or it might not. But something so simple was like news to me because I want to fix it.
Yeah. I mean, you're definitely not alone in that. I feel that way. I think a lot of us, like our impulses, like it's hard
Mhm.
to see people we care about hurting, so we want to fix it for them. But sometimes the most we can do is, like you said, acknowledge it and be like, I know this is hard, but like I'm here. Like I'm here next to you and I'll be here through it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that helps.
Yeah,
That really
it does.
helps. So, Janine, on page 20 of your book, you have the whole book is wonderful art. I really love it. But on page 20, and specifically, you have some wonderful bubble art, word bubble art that maps out what you call acceptable places to cry. And I want to thank you for putting that in the book. It really resonated with me and brought to mind the time that I wound up in tears at Walgreens. This was fairly early on when my wife was diagnosed with fibro, and she had been in the hospital and she was bedridden. She couldn't work. She couldn't barely walk. And so one day she's like, look, I can't stand in the shower. So I'm like, all right, this I have control over, right? So I went to Walgreens to buy her a shower chair. And I went into the aisle, what's got things for elderly people, like walkers, canes, these chairs for the shower. And I just started hysterically crying in the middle of Walgreens, and I just couldn't stop. And you know what? It was a good release,
Mhm.
and I'm glad that I was able to do that, because to bottle that up, uh, I don't think would have been healthy. But with that said, can you tell us more about this concept of acceptable places to cry?
Yeah, definitely. So basically, the gist of the graph of acceptable times places to cry is that they are all acceptable. And I I put that in there for a couple of reasons. Like one, I just wanted to acknowledge the experience of having your grief feel so pervasive that like at least for me, especially at the very beginning, like everything led back to my grief. Like everything led back to his death and everything made me sad. I mean, so much like grocery stores. I think grocery stores are hard for a lot of us. Like, the cheese aisle was really hard for me because it was like, oh, he loved cheese. And like that would be like all I needed to break down, or going to a cafe or riding a bus, like everything was triggering. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that experience. Um, and then the other reason why I put it in and why I called it acceptable times, places to cry is because I think a lot of us feel like we need to compartmentalize our grief. Kind of like what you were saying, like I have to go to work and I have to like not be a grieving person at work. I have to be like a productive, functional person. And I remember being like, I'm gonna grieve when I get home, right? Like I'm gonna grieve like between 7 and 9 p.m. And like that's the like quote unquote acceptable time and place for me to grieve, like after work, at home, in private. And that's just not true. And it doesn't need to be true, right? Like our grief is not something that we can easily like slot or like bucket in when it's
Mhm.
convenient. Like grief just like one, we can't really control it. And two, it just coexists. It coexists alongside everything else in our lives. Um, And so that's like part of what I wanted the spoke graph to speak to.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that's what this podcast Guts is all about. There's this fallacy that there's this thing like called work-life balance, right? And then when you go
Right.
to work, you work, right? And when you're home, you're like living your personal life, and that's a bologna sandwich, is what I like
Right.
to say. Because listen, all the stuff that's on our backs that we're carrying around, whether it's grief, depression, sadness, excitement, whatever, when we sit down at work, whether that's a home office or with other people, that's all with us. There's no separation.
Right.
And I think the more that organizations and businesses can start to acknowledge, hey, we're human beings, and to support our staff and make it feel more okay to like cry in the bathroom. I've cried in the bathroom more than once. I get it. I'm alone in my space most of the time. And, with COVID, my clients, we do Zooms, but so there are times when something just triggers me and I'm in tears. And I think it's a really important thing to bring up, because we're quote unquote supposed to be okay at work. And you know what? No, we are how we are wherever we are. And it's okay to be experiencing what we're experiencing. And you know what? It's okay to be completely unproductive because we're so upset about something. That's okay.
Yeah.
And I don't see that enough. I see these ridiculous expectations to like just be like a computer and work faster and harder and, bring work home and, oh, something's going wrong in your life, excuse my language, tough shit.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I'm also guilty of that, like I wrote this whole book on that's like basically like a giant permission slip to grieve for like however long you need to in whichever ways you do. And I believe like so deeply in everything that I've written. And yet there's this like tiny little voice in the back of my head that's like, oh, except you, right? Like this is true for everyone, like except you. Like you need to keep producing, you need to keep working. And like writing this book was really hard. I mean, writing a book is hard, but also it's so emotional and personal that I honestly, like when I set out to write it, I didn't bucket time for that emotional piece of it. It wasn't until I started writing it that I was like, oh, I need to like make space for how hard it is emotionally. But it's not something that I should have realized it from the outside, but I didn't, because I think, part of me was like, oh, I'm just gonna power through this like I do
Yeah.
everything else.
Mm-hmm. That is so ingrained in us, right? I mean, from early childhood, that's just like, so hopefully the book can help kind of break that paradigm for some people. And I love that concept of a permission slip. And you're so right, because like I'll look, at everybody, and we have very frank conversations, myself and my clients and my colleagues. I'm like this with everybody. I like talking about stuff that's people are living through and going through and experiencing. And it's like I so easily give that permission slip to everybody else. And then sometimes, like I'm about to cook dinner, I'm like, man, I am just really wrecked right now. I can't cook this chicken parmesan I had planned.
Yeah.
And I start to be like, well, why not? Why not? You should be good enough to cook it. And then I catch myself and I'm like, whoa, you have every right to say no to cooking this meal. What else can I cook, or do we do takeout?
Mm-hmm.
But this took me time. This took me time to strengthen this muscle, to be aware of this thought process and realize that it's not true, right? That it is okay to be grieving, or to not be able to cook the meal or whatever. And then, because my expectation is nobody else's, is what I found. I say to my family, I've got 2 boys and my wife, I'm like, listen, guys, I am not feeling up to cooking. And they'll be like, oh, let's just make a mac and cheese. We'll help you. Let's just go get pizza or whatever. And nobody's mad. Nobody thinks I'm a loser or a bad dad or a bad husband, except me.
Yeah. Yeah, we put a lot of it on ourselves. And then usually, at least in my experience too, like people have more grace for me than I have for myself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Has that been evolving for you as you continue to be aware of it, are you finding it easier to be kind to yourself?
I am. I am definitely always gonna be a work in progress, but I have been really trying to be more intentional about it, in sort of tangible day-to-day ways. So for example, like these conversations about grief, I really enjoy. I think they're so important to for us to have these honest conversations. And also, like, there are they're hard to have sometimes, right? Because we're talking about these really hard personal things.
Hmm.
And, the first couple times that I had these sort of conversations, I didn't bucket any time for me to, like, relax or, like, decompress afterwards, right? I was like, "I'm gonna, like, talk about grief from 1 to 2, and then I'm gonna write emails from, like, 2 to 4," right? And then the more I've been doing them, like, I can't do this, and I don't want to, and it's not good for me. Like, I would love to have this conversation, and then afterwards, like, I'm gonna go for a walk outside. So after each one, I'm like, I'm gonna go outside and I'm gonna do something that's not sitting in front of my computer. So like little things like that, I've been being more intentional about, and they've been really helpful.
That's fantastic. I mean, you're talking about self-care, right? And setting boundaries as well, which is super important, because if you go from one task to the other and you're not giving yourself time to decompress or process, partially process, it's everything suffers, right? Those emails will suffer. You'll be suffering writing those emails.
Right.
And that's Janine, that's an amazing point, because it's taking that time is not that quote unquote downtime is just as important as the podcast, is just as important as running the business or writing those emails. And that self-care is something I think that needs to be just as honored as eating and sleeping, and let's say breathing, right? Because you
Right.
can't get away with not breathing.
Right.
So that is an excellent point, and I'm glad to hear that you're doing that. I do something similar. I have a morning process where I meditate and exercise before I do anything else. So I have some time to kind of process the day before and kind of plan for the rest of the day to be in an emotionally better place. So I've got a couple more questions for you.
Great.
So one is humor. Humor plays a large role, and I've been following you on Instagram and seeing the real cool greeting cards you make, and some of the other work that you do. I see that you hand press each card, letterpress it's called, and which is super cool. I am a total geek about that. I'm a field notes and a vintage pencil and a Blackwing geek. We could probably have a whole conversation about that. And so I saw one of your videos. You were letterpressing, and if I'm misspeaking the name of it, please correct me. But I thought that was really neat.
Uh,
So
y Yeah, thanks. Yeah, no, that's correct. It's letterpress printing, and essentially I print on, just like those old giant printing presses, and so each card gets hand-fed, and inked and run through the press, and that for me has been, um, sort of like my form of meditation or like
mm,
my form of like therapy, because there's something about, again, like being away from a screen, doing something that is it's like kind of this in between state where it's kind of repetitive, but also you kind of have to pay attention because you're operating like this giant press. And there's something about that in between that I have been able to find, like a flow state from that has been, again, like really great for my mental health. And it's part of my process for producing cards that I sell, but it's also been a form of self-care for me.
yeah, that's super cool. I find that analog is not a dead thing. I think we all need it, and whether it's a walk or writing in a notebook or cranking out letterpress, it's I think it's part of the human existence and process. And I think sometimes that's why we run into issues, because we're always, especially in this pandemic, we're always on these screens. I catch myself every morning. I wake up and I'm like on my screen. I'm like, whoa, put it down for 5 minutes. So yeah, I think that's great. And I could see how that could be a meditative process for you. So what role can humor play when someone is grieving, especially when the last thing they feel like doing is laughing?
Yeah, so the book is it's, like, kind of weird to say I wrote, like, a funny book on grief, but that is kind of what it is or
Mm.
what I hoped it would be, and, you know, I think that in the book, I don't shy away from talking about the really hard, honest, complicated parts of grief, but there is also a sense of lightness to it that I wanted to bring because I think humor is important to us surviving really hard things, right? I think that we laugh not just when things are really light, but we laugh because things are so heavy that we need a break. Like we need like a moment of relief or we need a moment of joy. And humor for me is like such a critical like survival method. Um and it's also I found like a way to connect to others. I think if you talk to other people who are grieving, who have lost someone, I think a lot of us have kind of this, like, sense of dark humor, um, like, oh, like we were saying, like, "Can you believe that person said that to me?" Or, like, "Can you believe I, put my toothbrush in the dishwasher because I, like, have grief brain," right? Like, these things are, like allow us to, like, laugh about things that are really hard and for us to connect to each other, and so that's, like, something that I personally find really important, really helpful, and so I infuse it, like, in my cards and also in the book.
Yeah, and you strike a really nice balance because I agree with you. You don't shy away from the topic, but it doesn't become like didactically depressing or didactic in its like oppressiveness, right? So it's really nice, and I think there's when I read the book, I felt there was a warmth to the art, and the art is kind of what helps make it more lighthearted because these cute people you're creating in the book. But it kind of like also I felt lowered my defenses, for lack of a better phrase. I didn't feel like, oh, like I had to read this page and then like be okay.
Right.
I felt like every page I read, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That resonates with me. And I felt good about the grief I carry around. That okay, this is okay. How I'm doing this is okay. And so you accomplished something really beautiful with that.
Well, I'm so glad that that came across because that was definitely my intention. There are a lot of like really great grief books and resources out there, and I've read a lot of them, but a lot of them are written like by grief experts or like by therapists. And so sometimes I felt a little bit like I, like I'm a patient. Um
Yeah.
and I wanted the book to feel like a friend, right? Like I'm not an expert. I'm just like a person who's had a loss. But I wanted the book to feel like that. Like you're talking to someone who's like, I'm like you. I'm still figuring it out. Like here are some of the things that it felt like for me. Here's how it could feel like for you. And here are some of the things that I've learned along the way.
Yeah.
Like I wanted it to feel like talking to a friend.
Mhm. Yeah, that's wonderful. That's so interesting that you use those exact words because when I created my website for my business a decade ago, that's exactly what I wanted for the business is when people got to that homepage to immediately feel that they were sitting with a friend or a brother or a sister. Uh, because, that's what they get, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, I think you did a really good job of accomplishing that, and it probably wasn't effortless, but you make it seem effortless in the book.
There were a lot of tears shed behind the scenes.
Oh, oh. Well, I've got one more question for you, and then we can share how people can find you on social media and your website and stuff. But how has your experience, because we talked a little bit about you running your business, we talked about the cool letterpress, which I want one. How has your experience with grief affected running your business?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it ties back to some of what we were talking about before. So I was, when Nap died, I was running my business. I was running it as a side business, actually. And again, like my immediate thought was like, I'm just gonna keep doing what I've been doing. Like I'm gonna power through it. Um, and it really wasn't until I talked to some friends who were like, well, why don't you just close down your shop for a while and give yourself, again, like space and permission to not be working all the time while you're grieving. Um, and so I actually ended up shutting down my business for maybe like 4 or 5 months. Um, and I say that because I think a lot of us feel like we, should be able to like like we should be robots in some ways, right? Like while
Mhm.
we're grieving, we should still be producing. Um, but shutting down the business was such a good decision for me. And I mean, also like what we were talking about before, I was afraid of like losing customers or losing momentum or disappointing people. But I got such lovely notes back from people saying like, take all the time you need and we'll be here like when you're ready. And so just like giving myself that permission was so, so helpful and was really just the space that I needed. Um, and the other, I mean, it's impacted me personally in my business in so many ways. Like it's really shaped who I am. But one of the other ways it impacted my business is it's part of the reason why I decided to make art full time. So I was running my card business on the side and had like always thought about maybe one day, like how cool would it be if I could just run my own business, but I didn't really think it was feasible and I was kind of scared to make the leap. Um, and after Nap died, I think there's like a perspective shift that happens where, at least for me, like things that used to scare me don't really scare me anymore because the thing, like my baseline of like what is bad or like what is like what I can't handle has changed. And and so like that's part of the reason why I quit my job and I've been doing this full time for the last couple of years.
Wow. Hmm. Thank you for sharing that. That's that must have been really hard to close it down, and it's amazing that you did that. I'm thinking also like the financial considerations, because I'm sure that was bringing you income to pay your bills. So it's like I think sometimes we get stuck on, oh well, like, we worry about the money, which really money, I see money as, for the most part, as a short-term thing, right? You make it, you spend it, and that kind of repeats year after year. But without that baseline of self-care, I think the cost of what we lose can be much greater to ourselves, to our lifespan potentially, and to what we bring to the world. Whether it's now your business full time. I mean, you it was like you kind of went into like a hibernation of sorts professionally, and then came out, and it became something bigger and probably much more impactful than it was. Whereas if you would have kept doing it, who knows, you might have just burnt out and said, I'm done.
Yeah, yeah. I think one one of the questions I always ask myself and my friends is like, at what cost, right? And that's something that we don't always think about because. And the other thing I always say is like, just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? So
Yeah.
like, just because you can, there are opportunities to do things. Like just because you can doesn't necessarily mean that is right for you. Like sometimes saying no is the right thing to do, and there will always be more opportunities. There will always be other ways to make money. But I do
Mhm.
think that, like, if you are not in a good place, like, all of the opportunities and all the money in the world, like, isn't going to help.
Yep. Agree. For sure. Well, somehow, Janine, I have run out of questions. Although I feel like I could talk with you for another few hours. This has been wonderful. Before we wrap up, I just want to share again that the name of the book is Welcome to the Grief Club. And if you could just tell people where they can get their hands on a copy of the book, and also how they can get in touch with you online.
Sure. Yeah, so Welcome to the Grief Club is available pretty much wherever books are sold. I always encourage people to support their local independent bookstore if they can. And bookshop.org is a great website for that too, but it's also available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. In terms of where to find more about me and my greeting card business, everything is at Kwohtations.com, spelled Kwoh, like my last name.
Cool. Yeah, and there'll be some links in the show notes. So if anybody didn't get that, you can find the contact info there. Yeah, we've got the website, and then on Instagram, you're at Kwohtations, and also for the book, there's at Welcome to the Grief Club. And I highly encourage you guys to check those social media pages out too, because they're pretty cool, and you'll get to see some of Janine's art. And with that, Janine, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for doing this today and sharing your story and your experiences with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joey. And thank you for creating the space for us to have conversations like these.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. It helps me too, so it's my pleasure. Okay, bye.
Bye.